Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It is the 18th of April and actually quite a few nice updates this week. As always, if this is useful, a like, subscribe, comment and share, and hit that little bell icon to get notified when I post new videos. Speaking of which, new videos this week. I posted kind of a big demo and walkthrough of using the Azure CLI. This used to be kind of the cross-platform, but I can use it on Linux, on Mac OS, on Windows. So I kind of go through the setup and some of the kind of cool things you can do with it. And then I created, again, quite a deep dive video about really understanding the line between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. When do I use which? How are they different? So it's quite an involved video, but it really does go through what each of them can do, how they work best together. So on to the new features. So from the compute perspective, the Azure Kubernetes service, remember that managed Kubernetes offering in Azure, has a number of updates. So firstly, it now has this event grid integration. So remember, the whole point of event grid is that we have various sources of events. So there's some kind of thing that can generate events. And in the past, what we had to do, if we had something that wanted to respond to those events, you can kind of think of a handler. Well, it would have to kind of constantly poll and say, do you have anything for me? Do you have anything? Do you have anything for me? So what Event Grid does is, remember, Event Grid kind of sits in the middle and it does that polling and it does the checks for that. And then various types of handlers can basically say, hey, I want to get told about this. It could be a webhook, an Azure function, event hub, whatever. So what this is saying is now for AKS, if there's a new Kubernetes version available, if there's a new node image available, Event Grid can now take that event and then trigger whatever handlers I configure to go and act on that in some way. Again, a webhook function, whatever I want to do. I can now also create AKS clusters without local admin accounts. So ordinarily, if I create an AKS cluster, I have to specify, hey, a local admin. But AKS can actually integrate with Azure Active Directory. Well, if I do that, I don't have to have a local admin account anymore, which might be kind of a compliance or security problem. Now I can just specify an Azure AD user, Azure AD group instead, so I don't have to create those local admin accounts anymore. Also, encryption at host is now GA for AKS clusters. So remember, the whole point of this is fundamentally behind the scenes there's a physical box. And this applies actually, I can do encryption at host for VMs as well. So I have some physical box. Now, when you create a virtual machine, and again, this same thing applies if it's AKS and I'm getting pods and kind of worker nodes. Yes, there's the virtual machine, and then you have kind of a managed disk. Now, that managed disk can be encrypted either with kind of a platform managed key, or it can be a customer managed key. I define it, it's in my key vault. And these are kind of defined by using a disk encryption set. I put the managed disk in it, that controls the encryption. And I have a whole deep dive video on storage encryption if this is something you're interested in. So I'm controlling the encryption here, but remember you have other resources. On the local box itself, you can kind of think about, well, there's temporary storage that kind of your virtual machine sees, but also there are cache files. So there's a cache file for the OS, for the data disks, etc. And also, this data has to kind of travel over the wire to the box. So what this encryption at host does is now that temporary disk is always encrypted with a platform managed key. The cache files, well, they're going to get encrypted with basically the same key that's used to encrypt the disk. So that's going to be a platform managed key or a customer managed key, depending on what the disk encryption set is configured with. And also it's going to kind of actually encrypt it over the wire as well. So this is what this encryption at host does. It's been available for VMs for a while. Now I can use it for my AKS as well. And there's no additional cost to actually use that. So that's now GA. On the storage side, so Azure Blob and Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, which remember sits on top of Blob, has a new 200 terabyte per blob limit. Now, this is actually because a block blob, as the name kind of suggests, is made up of blocks. And what's happened is the maximum size of a block can now be 4 gigabytes in size. Well, if you think a block blob can be made up of 50,000 blocks, 4 gigabytes times 50,000 is roughly 200 terabytes. And again, because ADLS Gen 2 sits on top of the kind of that block blob, its files inherit the same characteristics. Now, I cannot create one of these through the portal today, but I can do it through the REST APIs and the other kind of APIs available as well. Azure Database for PostgreSQL Hyperscale. So remember, this is the kind of the big high performance, high resilient version of the managed Postgres service, has a number of new features. Now, this is still preview, so all of these features are preview as well. But basically, maintenance schedules. I have these server groups, and there's a default maintenance window. I think it's 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. But I can also do a custom schedule where I have to give it a 30-minute window, and it will do the maintenance within that window. And I'll get a notification through Azure Service Health. I'll get notification ahead of that there were kind of maintenance things happening. But I can control that maintenance window. There's now a basic SKU version. The whole point of what this hyperscale does, it separates the compute from the data. So I can have multiple kind of these compute containers that then go and talk to the data, which is in Azure Storage. So it separates those things out. What this lets me do is to start with, I just have one kind of compute instance, but it still stores the data in this distributed manner. So what that means is in the future, without downtime, I'll be able to switch from basic to standard and then start scaling out my compute because my data has already been stored in this distributed manner. I'm ready for kind of that hyperscale offering. And then same region read replicas. So this is really the idea that, hey, now I can actually have different sets of my Postgres hyperscale within the same region, and it's going to use this async replication to replicate to them. But if I have kind of really read-heavy workload, I can now direct that to these additional sets of servers that I can configure within now the same region, not just kind of DR to other regions. Oh, and Azure SQL MI can use these new service tags. So for SQL MI, I can use user-defined routes to control the flow of traffic to various other places. What they've actually done is they've added some SQL MI kind of specific service tags that I can now see and leverage those within my UDRs. So here is just kind of those listed out. So if I'm using SQL MI, I can now leverage those as part of my actual UDR. So all good stuff. Okay, next, miscellaneous. So there's a new Winter 2021 Windows Log Analytics agent. Now this is not coming to the end, but I think this actually might be the last major kind of version of this. Remember, it's moving to the new Azure Monitor agent. The new Azure Monitor agent really brings together the Log Analytics agents, the diagnostic extension, and the Telegraph agent we leverage for Linux. All of those are kind of going into this new Azure Monitor agent, which I think will be with us very soon. But this latest update for the Windows agent is really focused about the idea that, hey, I'm going to handle certificate changes better for various Azure services. It's got a built-in troubleshooting tool, but I think they said this will be the last 32-bit version of this agent. Windows Virtual Desktop MSIX app attaches now in the portal. Remember, MSIX app attach is all about a way to kind of separate the application from the normal kind of artifacts and installation process we have with an OS. It lets us take the MSI application and we can basically deploy it separately into a virtual disk, And then I can attach that, which is now this MSIX app, to a virtual machine. And now that application that was installed through the MSIX, not MSI, MSIX, is now available to it. And I can just dynamically add those in to my environment. So it keeps the image clean. I don't have to now have an image with 50 applications baked into it. And I can just attach these MSIX app attach virtual disks to them to make it available. Before I had to do this through PowerShell scripts. So I'd have to create custom scripts to do that attach. What they're now saying is with a few clicks in the portal and through the Azure Resource Manager like templates, I can actually now do this app attach. Log Analytics now has functions. So remember, Log Analytics lets me write these KQL, these Kusto query language queries against all of the data that I bring into my Log Analytics workspace. And I can always save those queries. But what I can actually do now is save them as a function. So if we quickly have a look over here. So what I'm going to do is just super fast go to a workspace. And I can look at the logs. And you can see I could always kind of type a query in here. And then once you start typing a query, really whatever you wanted to do, I mean, just usage summarize, it really doesn't matter. Put one of those in it. I could save it. So if I just did that one, if I can actually get this thing to work today, there I can run it. And I could do a save and save it as a query, and then I could always in the future just kind of open the queries back up. Over here, I can actually go and look at, well, what queries we have. I can go here as well, have this nice sort of query interface, but that's all available to me. But what I can now do, I can actually do a save as a function. Now that will make this have basically a keyword that I can now use in my queries. If I save it as a function, I can specify firstly the name, whatever I want to put in there, a category, but then, hey, parameters I want to be able to pass to this function. So I'm saving it as a function. Once I've done that, I get a number of things. So they're actually integrated, as you can see over here on the sidebar. I can see functions. So I can actually have my functions over here. I could see kind of mine. And you can see I've already created a function, just get VM available memory. So I might delete that out. If I just kind of double click it, there, that is my function. So I can just run that. And that is now just something available to me. And you see there's other types of functions kind of built in through various things. But I can just use that with my other queries I might do. For example, I could build on that just as usual. I could say I want to pipe that into something else. Maybe, hey, top 10 by, I don't know, time. No, don't do that. Let's do time generated, not time span. There we go. So I'm using my function in the first line, but I can just then carry on using that through the rest of my query. And I can kind of go and see that data. So this function ability is going to let me now generate blocks of KQL that I can then use really throughout the rest of my Log Analytics workspace queries and overall experience. So it just makes it a much richer environment for me. Okay, next. So Azure Monitor now has data encryption policies. This is really going to let me control, well, what is the type of encryption I'm having around my Azure Monitor environment. And we can see these. So if I actually jump over super quickly over to here again, I'm not going to go through all of them. You can kind of look at the notes to see them. But if I just go to policy for a second, and we'll look at the definitions, and we'll change the category to monitoring. And then if I just start searching for encryption, so we can see here, okay, well, Azure Monitor log clusters should be encrypted with a customer managed key. Should be created with infrastructure encryption enabled. Save queries in Azure Monitor should be saved in customer storage account for logs encryption. So there's a whole bunch of different ones available. I think if I search for application, me to do that. Yeah, and Azure Monitor logs for app insights should also be linked to a log analytics workspace where I can then control the encryption. So there's a bunch of these policies I can now use really about ensuring the data encryption that I'm leveraging through Azure Monitor. Have those available to me. And then log analytics workspace names no longer have to be globally unique. And they've made a change really on the back end how this works. They now just have to be unique per resource group. Now, there is still kind of the workspace ID, there's the resource ID, there's the fully qualified name. So if I want to be able to do kind of a cross workspace interaction, I probably can't just use the workspace name anymore. I'd want to use kind of the resource ID, I'd want to use the workspace ID, something else that is guaranteed to be unique, because the resource ID and the workspace ID will still be globally unique. Just the name just has to be unique per resource group now. Then Azure Automation finally actually supports a system managed identity. So remember, system managed identity is an identity for a particular resource in Azure. It's created in Azure AD, but only that particular resource can use that identity. And I can then give that identity permission to other resources in Azure using role-based access control. So now for my Azure Automation accounts, instead of having to kind of use those run as accounts and connections and all that kind of stuff, if I just now go to my automation accounts and I'll look at this, what we'll actually see is we now have this identity. So I can actually go and turn on the identity. So I now have a system managed identity for my automation account. So now within my kind of run books, I would just use the regular connect-az account -identity. And it will just automatically go and use the managed identity for this automation account. I no longer have to mess around with credentials and certificates and those types of things. Hey, I'm just going to use that nice managed identity to make my life really that much better. And then finally, there's now a user data in the VM metadata. So remember, the VM metadata is all about this Azure Instance Metadata Service. The idea is that as a virtual machine running in Azure, I can be running some kind of process inside that virtual machine. And so we have this Instance Metadata Service available in Azure, the IMDS, and I can just go to a particular IP address. It's always the same for every VM, and I can kind of make a RESTful call to that IP address, which represents this service and other things, and I can find out data about my environment. Well, now we have this ability to add kind of this user data byte64 encoded value to it at the time of provisioning, and then I can read that back into the virtual machine. So maybe there's some unique kind of configuration or unique role that I don't want to have to do through maybe a custom script extension or change my template. I just want to be able to, hey, from something inside, go and check on that value, and then maybe I do something different inside it. So I don't actually have one of these with that data, but what this is showing, this is just kind of the basic invoking a REST method to talk to this. Hopefully you can see this okay. This kind of 168.254.169.254. It's always that IP address. And if I run this command, oh, that's strange. There we go. You can see all of this data. So this is all information that it's actually getting about the Azure Fabric. So I'm seeing things like, okay, the image, I can see the resource group name I'm in. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I can actually see here. So I've got all of this information. And basically what would happen now is if I had a user data, it would be available here as well. And I'd now be able to do something with that data, reference, whatever I want to do. And I do actually, if we look at the slide, we just jump over for a second. If we look at their example, they actually show an example of that user data. So we can see over here, it looks kind of junk because it's kind of this byte 64 encoded. But we can see it talks about custom data that's been there for a while. And that's really being deprecated and disabled. Use user data instead. And then we can actually see, hey, this user data, when the VM was created for use during or after provisioning, that base 64 encoded. So I'll just be able to go and get that. And it's got examples of calls in the documentation. Really fit everything I would need to do to leverage that in the most efficient way. And that's it. That's all the updates for this week. As always, I hope this was useful. Until next week, take care.